Hello, welcome to Conversations in Pelagianism. I'm Dan Chapa, and I'm joined as always by my good friend Turton Fan. And I guess this is our fourth recent episode on Pelagianism. So, have been exploring it, but this episode is coming from the other angle. So, in this episode, we'll explore some arguments from um, uh, Dr. Guillaume Bion and Kittel, I believe, on basically a reductio ad absurdum. If somebody holds to libertarian free will, does that imply Pelagianism? Will be the question under discussion. And just for starters, just from the get-go, um, Turton Fan may be a little bit trapped between our friendship and the fact that a lot of Calvinists have called Arminians semi-Pelagians, if not Pelagians, in the past. And I don't want him to feel uncomfortable. I want him to be able to speak his mind. And although I've had trouble with that, I'll try to get over that. And so I just want to discuss the arguments, the issues, and it's where necessary that this might be a little bit more philosophical, because Dr. Bion is a philosopher, so is Kittel, I think. Anyways, it might be a little bit more philosophical. It'll get into some definitions and stuff like that, but we'll start there, I guess. And I have some slides, so we can go ahead and start digging in. But Turn Fan, if you have anything you want to say by way of introduction, that'd be cool.
Yes, I'm appreciative for this opportunity to continue our discussion. I was also appreciative to at least one of our listeners who reached out and had some more comments on Bonner's book. So I don't know if we're planning to do any follow-up episodes on that or not. We don't have a concrete plan to do so right now, but I do appreciate those follow-up thoughts and as well, just everyone who's been listening and watching. So I guess without a lot of further ado, you've go ahead.
Sure. So I've primed the pump, but I did it independently. So I think before you get into the philosophical discussion of an argument against, does libertarian free will imply Pelagianism? I think the first step is, well, what is Pelagianism? What is semi-Pelagianism? Now, I'll give a quick recap of the episode where I discussed it. That's a question for historic theology, right? It's not so in philosophy, you can start defining, you can just stipulate a definition, and as long as you define it that way and are consistent with it, it works. But in historical theology, no, you got to go back to the historical arguments and historical documents and see where did that term come from. And so I think that term is best described from a historical standpoint. That's why I started there. But that said, just to recap, I think that Pelagianism is probably best defined as disagreement with the essential points of the Council of Carthage in 418. And then semi-Pelagianism is probably best defined as disagreement with the essential points in the Canons of Orange in 529. Now, that said, I also understand that there's complexities, especially the baptism of infants are in both of those documents. But we also have to remember that that wasn't the point of contention, because both Pelagians and non-Pelagians at that time were baptizing infants. And also the baptism remission for sins. Now, so we believe in justification by faith alone. It is a point of contention or disagreement with those that hold to baptismal regeneration, so to speak, or that baptism basically saves an individual, whether an infant or an adult. They would have and did in their writings link baptism and faith, but I think it is fair to say that those two are slight differences of opinion, but I don't think they're the essential. Now, what is essential about that is that even infants need salvation. So I think that does start to get into the core definition of Pelagianism. But I would define it along those lines, just as a starting out point. Now, but I will admit, though, it's a little bit nuanced, because I have to carve those things out and just try to get to, well, what's the essence of the council saying? Now, what is the essence of the council saying? I think for Pelagianism, it's kind of a denial of original sin in general, including but especially passing of concupiscence. And then it defines grace as supernatural rather than just creating man with free will, or Christ giving us good examples, or God teaching us through the law. It's a supernatural work in the heart. So I think those things are defined in Pelagianism itself. And then in semi-Pelagianism, it's a denial that prevenient grace is necessary. It's an assertion that prevenient grace is necessary to initiate conversion. And both of those counsels are in the context of people being able to merit salvation. So prevenient grace is, so semi-Pelagianism is denial of the necessity of prevenient grace in the context of meriting salvation, and that sort of thing. So that, but we can go back to check out the previous episode on that point if you want some detail, but I'll just start with those definitions from my point of view. Now, Turd and Finn, you're obviously welcome to agree, disagree, or hold the issue, and we can get into it as it comes up. It's up to you. If you want to offer your thoughts on those points, that's fine. If you want to just, I just would respect your right to disagree with me.
I appreciate that. I've often been a fan of that Shakespeare's line from Romeo and Juliet, like, a rose by any other name would suppose meet, this what's in a name philosophy. And I'm, if someone were to say, well, going forward, we're just going to call Calvinism Pelagianism, I don't think, I think it would be a weird thing to say, and it would definitely confuse people and mislead them, because they're not, because there is a well-established, at least, cloud of, even if it's not a well-established, like firmly, all the lines are drawn neatly, the idea that Calvinism is Pelagianism is an odd kind of assertion for people to make. But I'm trying to think back. There was a few years ago, I think it was Jay Dyer who did it, and I don't remember if he actually said Calvinism is Pelagian or not, but he did a bunch of things where he kind of said, well, Calvinism is Arian, Calvinism is I forget. He kind of went through a bunch of names of historic heresies and attached Calvinism to them, and I had some responses to him at the time about it. I'm happy to think about it in terms of, for the purposes of discussion today, if the idea is, let's focus on the council, I'm trying to remember which Council of Orange it is.
The 529. If you Google like the canons of the Council of Orange, it should come right up.
Let's see. So, like, if we focus on the Council of Orange and the Council of the 418 Council of Carthage, that's, I'm happy to think about it, to analyze things in terms of, does it fit within the description of this council, as opposed without kind of getting into the question, or without separately arguing the other question of, like, what's the right boundaries of the label generally, but assuming the label is the councils that you've mentioned, does it fit those definitions? I'm happy to do that. I think that might be a helpful way of doing it, thinking about it in terms of kind of the first group being the counter, or the folks condemned by Carthage 418, and the others being folks condemned by Orange 529. Are, if we look at it like that, LFW stands for Libertarian Free Will. Maybe I should add it. Well, it's too late. We already started. But
yeah, so Libertarian Free Will is opposed to Compatibilist Free Will. So Compatibilist Free Will is usually the idea of, you can if you want to, whereas Libertarian Free Will is just kind of a unstipulated, or it's just a categorical ability. And it's essentially the opposite of determinism, where determinism basically is based on God's decrees or the laws of nature, the laws of logic, whatever the case might be. A person's actions are determined. They, in that absolute sense, can't do otherwise. Whereas on libertarian free, well, yes, you can. You can do otherwise. So, well, actually, at least from a source standpoint, it's going to be that given the antecedent conditions, nothing is necessary in that absolute sense. Okay. Anyways, okay. With all that said, want to dig in?
Sure thing. Yeah.
Okay, I am going to do the superlapsarian approach. I'm going to start at the end. So this is slide 15, but we'll jump back. But I wanted to start out with what I thought were some of the ways to address all the arguments first. And then when we go through the arguments, we can just discuss these ideas and see if they solve the arguments or not. So the first idea is saving grace, which is basically justification, adoption, redemption, those sorts of saving graces that God provides to believers. And the idea here, the important point is that we don't work for salvation, we don't earn salvation, we don't merit salvation. And even if faith is a good thing, and I think faith is a good thing, it's not based on the good thing that faith is, that we're saved, that God could have chosen not to save believers, but he did. He chose to save believers. And so that salvation is a pure act of grace. It's a free gift and not something that we've earned, merited, worked for, obtained. It's not a debt that God owes us, anything like that. It's just a free gift. So I think that's an important point to keep in mind. That is potentially a difference between Arminians and, let's say, the Roman Catholic position of meritorious works and that sort of thing. Now, they have some complicated definitions and questions to get into there, but so I won't explore that too far. Only to say that Arminians do hold to sola fide, that we're justified by faith alone, without the works of the law or without works. So, anyways, that's the first point that I think we need to keep squarely in view, because I think it can be helpful in addressing some of the arguments that are coming up. The next is the idea of prevenient grace, where it's a supernatural work of God in the human heart to enable certainly enable conversion, like repentance and faith and that sort of thing, but also any work that's pleasing to God, any good work in the sense that it's pure, in the sense that it's perfect. Now, I'm not saying that people are utterly depraved without prevenient grace. It's not like people are as evil as they possibly can be. But at the same time, everything that people do without prevenient grace is going to be impure, tainted with sin. It'll have the wrong motives. Even if it's somebody that's, let's say, being honest on his taxes, is still tainted with sin without God's grace. So prevenient grace, and it's a grace that comes before and enables our work before. So I think that's going to be part of the solution. And those first 2 points are essential to Arminianism. The third one is not. It's an optional position that Arminians can hold, but sometimes do and sometimes don't. Some Arminians will disagree on this point, but a lot of them hold to it. Now, Arminius himself seemed to hold to this ambulatory grace model. Now, what I mean by ambulatory grace, so it's somebody is in the ambulance going to the hospital, and the ambulance is just going to take them to the hospital unless they resist and fight and, kick down the doors of the, basically jump out of the back of the ambulance. So the idea is that God's grace brings us through conversion, and we do nothing. But if we resist, then we can stop God's grace from bringing about that change. Like I said, that's not all Arminians hold to that. I hold to that. I think Arminius held to that. Kenneth Keithley is the one that made that kind of famous in recent years, but not all Arminians hold to it. We will see Kevin Tempe saying something like that when he talks about quiescence of the will, but we'll get into that So I'll table that for now. But that's one concept that may become relevant at certain points. Okay, PAP, P-A-P, the principle of alternative possibilities. That means like if you can choose chocolate or you can choose vanilla. There's two alternatives and they're real. But can you have PAP without the idea of odd implies can? So odd implies can is this idea that if you should do something, then you must have the ability to do it. So if you should tell the truth, then you have the ability to tell the truth. If you have that sort of thing. So can you have alternative possibilities without odd implies can? And the answer I think is yes, because even if somebody has only sinful options, then they still have options. So let's say your options are to cheat on the test by writing the answer on the bottom of your shoe, or cheat on the test by writing the answer, burying the answer within your tie. And you have these two options, but they're both bad, but at least you have options. So you have alternative possibilities, even though you don't have an option to be honest on the test. Now, that's a silly example. That's not the way it actually works, but I just make it, I just put that out there to illustrate the point. Then next is responsibility based on sourcehood, not PAP. Now that one is the most, PAP is a principle of alternative possibility. So it's the idea that unless you have alternative possibilities, you're not responsible for your actions. So you have to have, let's say somebody is choosing whether to be faithful in his marriage or not faithful in his marriage. And unless they can do either, then they're not responsible. That's the base idea behind PAP, principle of alternative possibilities. And so here, the one question is, well, maybe responsibility isn't tied to the principle of alternative possibilities, but rather based on sourcehood, that the action came from us without being determined by some external outside thing. Libertarian free will. Okay, so just straight out from the get-go, this episode is going to be far more complicated and philosophical because the arguments that we're going to deal with are far more sophisticated. But okay, so libertarian free will, once again, is LFW. It's the idea that everything we do is not determined. We have choices between alternatives, that those choices are based on us and not determined by something outside of us, or even something outside of us determining something inside of us that determines what we do, but rather we are undetermined and truly the source of our own choices in that sense, in that very strong sense of it not being determined. And then the last point is that perfection could be a second work of grace. So now this point is highly contentious, but within Wesleyan tradition, there was this idea of perfection, a doctrine of perfection. Now, it was limited because it didn't include like mistakes, or it didn't include things that you're ignorant of. But on willful sin, they did start to teach that perfection was at least possible, theoretically possible, in that it was not based on just simply believing the gospel and get regenerated, but at some point later in life, you could, God might grant a second work of grace that enabled a person to reach perfection. So that was a whole lot. I assume you'd have a lot of questions, a lot of disagreements, stuff like that. And that's certainly fine. So we can pause here to discuss them, or we can get into the specific arguments by Dr. Bignon at this point. But I just wanted to lay these out because I'm going to invoke these ideas at different times to respond to some of his different arguments.
Okay. Maybe when you respond to his arguments, if the application is raises questions to my mind, at that point I would have more questions. But I just wanted one clarification about what you meant by ambulatory grace. Could you? I may have just temporarily zoned out, or I just missed something, but I somehow didn't catch exactly what you meant there.
Sure. So I'll give you two examples. Okay. So the one is used by Arminius himself. He gives the example of two wrestlers. Let's say one of the wrestlers is the human will, and the other wrestler is the Holy Spirit in this illustration. And The idea is that if the two wrestlers, if one of them uses all his muscles to try to keep the other guy from lifting him, okay, so let's say one of the wrestlers comes in and is trying to do a forklift operation to lift the other guy off the ground. Okay, so if the one wrestler doesn't do anything, then he's going to get lifted. But if he resists with all his strength to force himself to stay down, then he can stop the other wrestler from lifting him. Okay, now in the context of the human will, when God's grace starts working on us, it moves us from unbelief into saving faith, unless we resist. So if we just sit there, then we get converted. If we resist, then we don't. So that's one illustration of it. The illustration I like to give is the dog, right? So my dog is in a house and it's on fire. I run in and I grab the dog, pick the dog up, and I'm going to carry him out of the house. If he lets me, then we'll get out of the house and he'll live. If he doesn't, let's say he freaks out and bites me, I might drop him and he might die in the house fire.
I think I follow. So I guess let's proceed with that level of understanding that I have or don't at this point. All right.
Sure. All right. Now let's go back to the infralapsarian approach. We'll start with the beginning. Okay. So this is a Dr. Guillaume Bion in Excusing Sinners and Blaming God, a Calvinist assessment of determinism, moral responsibility, and divine involvement in evil. And it's a very excellent book. He's like the new Jonathan Edwards, so to speak. He's anyways. So he goes back to Luther here. He says, according to Luther, if the PAP, principle of alternative possibilities, is defended by Erasmus proves anything, it proves that free will has not just some small degree of endeavor or desire, but full force and completely free power to do all things without the grace of God and without the Holy Spirit. Luther seems to claim that if PAP, principle of alternative possibilities, is true, it can and hence must be applied to the full series of one's life choices and yield to the conclusion that any human being, albeit fallen, can live and could have lived a perfect sinless life, which is supposed to be absurd per Christian belief. Okay. So many of the points that we just raised are highly relevant here. But just to restate the argument, he's basically saying if you have free will to be able to start something, then you should have the free will to be perfect. Because what you're applying to one little thing should apply to an infinite, to anything, and then you end up with at least theoretical perfection. So that's the first argument. Now, I think it should be clear that many of the points I've already raised are going to be used to solve this. But the first is the necessity of prevenient grace, I think, because what he's saying, he's talking about doing something without God's grace and without the Holy Spirit. Now, perhaps that's what Erasmus said, and so perhaps Erasmus is falling short of, the Arminian position at this point. But it doesn't seem like this argument hits squarely for somebody that does hold to the necessity of prevenient grace. Now, we can put ourselves in Erasmus's shoes, and so let's, for the sake of discussion, say, well, what if Erasmus is right that there is no prevenient grace, and not that Erasmus says that, but let's say anybody says, okay, well, there is no prevenient grace. Now, does this argument hit home? I think the answer is yes. Now, how good that argument is going to depend is because, okay, so now can you extrapolate that from one sinless act to an infinite series of sinless acts so you can become perfect, is going to be It depends on, well, can you do that? Can you kind of keep it up? What about your stamina? Well, what if there's some other limitation? That sort of thing. So I think there's still some question as to how sound this argument is, even if somebody denies prevenient grace. But with prevenient grace on the table, I think that this charge doesn't land on the jaw of an Arminian yet. Anyways, that's what I make of this so far. What do you make of this argument?
Well, I guess I would ask to back up a second, because this, I think you kind of mentioned it in a tangential way, but this argument comes before Arminius, much less Arminianism or as an ism. But of course, there are aspects of Arminianism that have precedent. It's some entirely new construct that just Arminius gave birth to. So it's possible there's some that Erasmus or Luther or both have some aspects of Arminianism in their understanding. But in terms of the heading you've given here, the heading is that the principle of alternative possibilities implies the ability to be sinless. I wonder if that stands and fall, or if that stands regardless of whether someone says that there is such a thing as prevenient grace, or that prevenient grace does anything. At least, let me put it this way. Between the statement that this principle implies the ability to be sinless, in that statement, I don't hear anything about grace one way or the other way. It's not, in other words, it's not saying that God doesn't give prevenient grace. So how does I guess what I'm kind of getting, maybe I'm coming to it in a long circuitous way. How does holding to prevenient grace undermine this? Is it because prevenient grace, if you hold to prevenient grace, you're saying you don't have the principle of alternative powers, or are you saying, is it some other reason?
Okay, so fair enough. So I was reacting more to, I latched onto the words, the grace of God, without the grace of God and without the Holy Spirit there. But okay, so but let's, for the sake of discussion, abstract out PAP implies the ability to be sinless. Okay, so there, I'd say it's interesting. So I think there's two issues to flesh out. One is on the pre-regenerate side, and the other is on the post-regenerate side. Okay, so once somebody is regenerate, I'm going to say that God is giving prevenient grace all the time to that individual to enable them to continue trusting his promises and obey his commands. So there's a theoretical sense there in which a person could be sinless. Now, it doesn't actually happen, but it does seem like it's possible. Now, I'd also quickly say Augustine said the same thing. In fact, Augustine got questioned. What is it? One of his works is explicitly answering that charge, and he starts to say, well, the argument against Augustine for saying he can be perfect was something to the effect of, well, how come it never happens? If it's possible, how come it never happens? And Augustine gives example after example of unexemplified possibilities. And a couple of them he says is, well, Christ could have called down 12,000 angels, or Christ could have destroyed the Egyptians, but he didn't, instantly destroy the Egyptians, but he didn't, or God could have, the Father. And then he says, well, the Father could have given Israel the land without a fight, but he didn't. And he gives some scriptural examples. And he goes on and on with like a couple different cases of, well, there's things that are really possible that never actually happen. And he uses that to establish the principle that, well, just because something is possible doesn't mean that we need to find an example of it. And this is a case like that. It's possible for a regenerate believer with prevenient grace to be sinless. But in that sense, and within the context of the regenerate, from that moment forward of regeneration, I'd have to grant the argument. PAP implies the ability to be sinless, perhaps, depending on how we define PAP, setting aside one of the later qualifications I made on PAP without the PAP between good and evil, and also setting aside sourcehood rather than PAP. So bracketing those two, taking them off the table, then I would say, yes, that's true. Now, if we look at moral responsibility in a different way, then maybe it's not like if moral responsibility is based more on sourcehood rather than PAP, then no, we don't end up with this implication. But I think the better way to understand it at this point is that God does enable PAP for regenerate believers to avoid sin. And in that sense, I'll just bite the bullet and accept it for a regenerate believer. Now, the other side, sorry, go ahead. You go ahead and address that. But I think we also need to talk about before regeneration too. But go ahead.
Yes, I think I might be wrong, but I think you may have misspoken when you were talking about the regenerate believer and then using the term prevenient grace there.
Why not? Why? Regenerate believers receive prevenient grace.
Oh, okay. So it was not a you were using it for that. You were intentionally using it for that then. Okay. Yes. I thought it was just a misspoke. Okay.
Yeah. So before our, I guess, any good work that we do, God's grace is enabling that good work. Though, I mean, in fact, the descriptions in Scripture of the Holy Spirit leading and our works being the fruit of the Spirit are perhaps even stronger for believers than they are for unbelievers. It's interesting. But anyways, okay, now let's talk about before regeneration. Okay, so two things could be possible here. Again, a person could say, well, God always gives prevenient grace at every possible moment before. I don't think that's the case, but somebody, an Arminian, could say that, and in which case they would probably just have to bite the bullet. On the other hand, they could say, which I do, that God doesn't always give prevenient grace. Sometimes, and especially the law helps us realize that we're sinners stuck in sin and need saving grace. So there's that aspect. Now, even an Arminian that said, well, let's say God is carpet bombing prevenient grace, giving it to everybody all the time, they could still make a distinction between, but we still need God's grace for forgiveness and that sort of thing. They could still say there's a stamina issue. So just because you can obey in one instance doesn't mean you can continue to obey 100 times in a row. They could still say that it's more theoretical rather than practical, which we'll get into on future slides. But I think there's ways to avoid the implication that therefore there are people out there kind of earning their salvation by living perfect lives. But there is I think their position is weaker. And one of the reasons, this probably is one of the reasons why I don't think that that's the case, that God extends prevenient grace to every person at every moment their whole lives. So anyways.
Okay. On this point, okay, I do understand that there's this, I've heard the people use the expression universal prevenient grace. I don't know who believes it and who doesn't believe it, but assume if we say for the sake of identifying another group other than the universal prevenient grace group, say that there is a group that says that kind of, there's a time there's a person is born, they are conceived, they're born, they go about their lives for a while, and then at some point in time, and it's different, it might be different from person to person, but God comes in and starts giving them prevenient grace. But before that time, they're living their life without this prevenient grace. For the people in that group, does the principle of alternative possibilities imply the ability to be sinless?
I'm sorry. So just to restate that, if God is not giving somebody prevenient grace,
Or at least not yet.
not yet, right? So that it does PAP imply the ability to be sinless? No, because
Yeah, go ahead.
because PAP could be between sinful options.
So that seems to be the nub of Luther's assertion. He's saying that if you have free will, if you have this small degree of free will, like you're saying, between two different evil things, that this somehow implies the argument for this principle, or the necessity of this principle, implies that it has a much broader power as well. You can't lock it down to just between two bad things.
Okay, so let's talk about the significance of. So when I say between evil options, I should be careful. Let me say it a different way. Between two imperfect options, both options are tainted with some degree of sin. Now, again, it could be that, like, let's say that there's three people. Two of them are non-Christians, and then one of them is a Christian. And so the one non-Christian cheats on his wife, and the other non-Christian is faithful to his wife, and the Christian cheats on his wife. Okay, in that case, relatively, the unbeliever who was faithful to his wife did the better thing. But the problem is they didn't do it for the glory of God. They didn't do it out of love of God. They didn't do it out of fear and respect for God's authority. So it's still tainted with sin. Now, what the implication? Let's take, and I think actually there's, like, in U.S. law, I think in some U.S. law documents, there's actually discussion of free will and this ability to do otherwise as sort of foundational. It's true that in governing a civil society, it is important that people be able to externally do the right thing. And they can, without being perfect, without it being pleasing to God. So it's highly relevant in our day-to-day lives. But where it breaks down is, is it pleasing to God? Is it pure? And there the answer is no, and that God is going to hold somebody accountable for it. Now, on that side, even an Arminian could still say, well, but what about the fall? Because before, in the Garden of Eden, Adam did have it in a more absolute sense. Now, even if a fallen sinner does not, as a result of Adam's sin, you could still defend the justice of God's commands, that God isn't commanding the impossible, because Adam had the ability to do otherwise and obey God perfectly. So, and I think it's fair to say, for in Adam's case, that PAP did apply the ability to be sinless. But in our case, even if God isn't extending prevenient grace all the time, and sometimes PAP is limited to to impure options or less than perfect options, there's still utility in our ability to be relatively good, in that it helps run civil societies. Does that make sense?
It makes sense that there's value in relative good. My concern is this. Maybe the source of my concern is more about the definition of principle of alternative possibilities. So one of the definitions that I've read for it is, a person is morally responsible for what the person has done only if the person could have done otherwise.
Right.
And the question seems to be more, or the question seems to be, if you're saying that this principle applies to, or this applies to, well, let's just call the person John. So if John is a person who is faced with a moral decision, there's something he needs to do, and he's going to be judged based on what he's done. And setting aside prevenient grace, this is before the time that prevenient grace enters the picture. Before he has prevenient grace in the picture, first of all, is it possible for him to have moral responsibility prior to receiving any prevenient grace? Is that a category that exists?
Is it possible for him to have moral responsibility before he receives prevenient grace? Yes.
And that's in that case, if I understood the acceptance of total depravity, or at least the form of total depravity, which, as you said, I think that sin taints everything that we do. He seems like he's being morally responsible for the evil or imperfect, whatever term you want to use for it, but for the choice that he makes, even though there is no choice that he could make that's not tainted by evil. All of his choices are tainted by evil, but he's still held morally responsible for those choices.
Yeah. Now, once again, assuming there is no such thing as universal prevenient grace.
Right.
Right. Yes. Now, the reason why he's in this state is because when Adam had PAP in terms of perfection versus sin, he fell, and that consequently resulted in this person being in this state. Now, let's take John, though, because most of the time, John can do something better than what he does, right? So he does something, but he could have done something better. And that's so what he does is sinful, and he could have done something better. Now, what if John actually does the absolute best that he can? That is a tougher question. But when I say like John could have done something better, so let's I forget. Well, let's say like John is honest with like 95% of his taxes, but not 5%. Well, he could have been honest on 100% of the taxes and just not done it for the glory of God, right? Okay. So, but let's say John is 100% honest with his taxes. And so in that sense, he's done the best he can in that circumstance. He still could have and should have repented of his sins and been justified by God's grace and enabled by God's grace to be 100% honest with his taxes for the glory of God. So, I still think that, but I will say that does require prevenient grace. So, okay. So, I guess barring that, yeah, I guess I need to take that off the table, don't I? Let me back that up. I apologize. Rewind that last bit. I'll edit it out. Okay. So yeah, I guess I have to admit that, yeah. So John, in that case, he's done the best he could, but it's still tainted with sin, and he's still morally responsible. And the reason why that's the case is because he's fallen in Adam. He has a corrupt nature.
So there's two branches I'd like to explore off of that point.
Okay.
The first branch is within this category of choices presented to a person who does not yet have prevenient grace, assuming that there's not a universal prevenient grace scenario necessarily, because otherwise, if there is, then there's no such person. There's no category of persons that don't yet have prevenient grace. Is the person without prevenient grace yet under a moral obligation to have faith?
Yes.
And if you accept that prevenient grace is necessary for that, then it would seem to follow that he has a moral responsibility to do that, and he has no ability to do it. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. So that would seem to say that for that person in that scenario, if that's a possible scenario, then that suggests that the principle of alternative possibilities is broken, since the person is morally responsible for believing.
Oh, wait. Remember the way you define PAP?
Yes, I do. I have it in front of me.
He did it. He did something, and he could not have done otherwise. That's the way you defined it.
I defined it this way. I said a person is morally responsible for what the person has done only if the person could have done otherwise.
Yeah. So they could. Yeah. Of course, the person could have done otherwise.
He could have believed.
No. Otherwise.
Otherwise, then right now he did not believe. What would be the otherwise than not believing?
Okay. So again, let's take the Pharisees, right? So they could openly and hostilely oppose Christ to his face, or they could follow along for the bread and the drink. But they could either be hypocrites or they could be hostile. Pat.
They could be hypocrites or hostile. But that's not the point on which they're judged for not believing.
Okay, so right. But I thought okay. So now let's define PAP in two different ways. So one is the ability to do good or evil, and the other is the ability to do otherwise.
Okay.
And I think if you had said PAP requires the ability to do good or evil in any and all circumstances, your argument would hold good. But since you defined it as the ability to do otherwise, I don't think your argument holds good.
So it seems as though what you're saying is that, well, I'm trying to square that up, because it seems like on the one hand, the issue is whether the person believes or not, which is a binary item. And then you seem to be suggesting, well, he's not believing in this other way, or in way A or way B. But both of those, way A and way B, are both examples of just not believing. So as to the question of not believing, he is not believing, and he's not doing something otherwise than not believing. He's only doing the not believing. He's doing the not believing in one of several different ways he could do it. But as to believing or not believing, he's only doing the not believing.
Right. So there's not believing A and not believing B, and he chooses between those. So he can always do otherwise. So if he did A, he could have done B. If he does B, he could have done A. That's PAP. Unless you're defining PAP as the ability to choose between good or evil.
Well,
which I don't know why you wouldn't just accept that and say, yeah, that's what I'm looking for, is a PAP between good and evil.
Well, what I'm interested in is I'm interested in well, let me put it this way. It seems as though we're this really just since this drives me towards the second branch of the two branches I mentioned before.
Okay.
So imagine that God has predetermined everything that's going to happen and deterministically caused everything that's going to happen, except for these free choices of free human beings. But when I say free choices of free human beings, what I mean is that at any given time, for any given choice, they make a choice which, in terms of its effect on them and everyone else in the world, there two things are indistinguishable from each other. So, you know, if it's like he's going to rob a bank, he's choosing between robbing a bank and robbing a bank with a very small difference. Now, it's not so small. It's not such a big difference like robbing it on Monday versus robbing it on Tuesday. No, it's going to be on Monday, and it's going to be the First National Bank or the Second National Bank. It will be the First National Bank, and it will be with a gun, not with a gun or a knife, and it will be he'll kill these person and this person, not he will kill or not kill, and he will, you know, and you go down and down and down, and eventually there is a small difference, but it's just a difference between one quark, one subatomic particle difference from another, and that subatomic particle's difference is subsequently canceled out in terms of its mechanical effects on the rest of the world by God immediately afterwards, so that any ripples from man's free will are not taken into account. That seems like an absurd case, but if this principle of alternative possibilities is really all that's necessary for moral accountability, essentially you could have a fully deterministic system, except for this tiny, minute, easily correctable issues. Is that an acceptable implication of that process?
Yeah, I think it is. I think I'd have to. Okay, so I think another way to state your question is, you know, is the absence of determinism and the presence of sourcehood in the sense of the absence of determinism important for moral responsibility? And I think the answer is just yes.
Well, can you have sourcehood apart from the principle of alternative possibilities?
Well, this is okay. It is a PAP. It's a PAP between quartz A and quartz B, and which implies that God didn't determine quartz A or quartz B, whatever. I apologize. But there's an A and a B, and God didn't determine it. The person does. And is that important for responsibility? I think the answer is yes. Yes, it is.
Okay. Well, why is that important?
Because it's undetermined. Because it's what the person did, not what God did for you know, by determining them to do what they do. It's yeah. So right. So it's just from a simple fact that it's up to them, not God.
So the fact that they do evil is 100% up to God. The fact that they do that evil by robbing a bank is up to God. On Monday is up to God. Using a gun is up to God. Killing two people in the process is up to God. Everything's up to God except for some minor detail, which itself has no particular moral significance.
Okay. Yeah. So now your example is contrived, right? So
right.
You know, the implications of this is much broader, like we talked about. It can, you know, be used for civil law, and it doesn't apply to Adam before the fall, and blah blah blah. So yeah, you got to put it back into that context to handle those. But if we abstract all that out and just isolate it down, is it important that it's undetermined? Now, we may have just an intuitive difference, and that's okay. I think we just have to accept it and live with it. And in fact, I'm appreciative of the fact that you've isolated the variables. But at the end of the day, yeah, the fact that it's not determined, but this person is the source of A versus B matters to me. That's fundamentally important. And for you, it's not fundamentally important. And it's good that we've identified this point of disconcurrence.
So one reason for that disconcurrence might be that it seems like the intuitive value of the principle of alternative possibility relates to I'm trying to think of the right English word to use here, or any language word for that matter, to use here, but the person is responsible. The person's responsibility seems like it should somehow have something to do with his level of control of the situation, so that, you know, if if you're holding him guilty for killing someone, and he was guaranteed he had no ability not to kill, that seems where the place where this PAP would normally trigger, and you would normally say, well, hold on a second, he couldn't help it that he was going to kill, and then you say, well, but he could have killed one slightly quark differently than the other way. That doesn't intuitively, it doesn't make much sense.
I agree. So, right, we don't need a totally depraved person can avoid murder.
Well,
There's
you stipulate that he could.
Well, I know. Okay, so an utterly depraved person probably couldn't avoid murder, but a totally depraved person can avoid murder in a way that is impure, in a way that does not glorify God, in a way that's not pleasing to God, but they still can avoid murder.
Well, you say that they can, because I think you're saying that God hasn't determined them to commit a murder.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. So yes. Okay. So that's the difference. Determinism. Yeah. Right. Determinism is universal on determinism. It's baked into the definition. So they, in an absolute sense, they can't, if determinism is true. But I don't think determinism is true.
But it isn't determinism if there's even this one quark difference that they can make. This one subatomic particle difference. That's not determinism anymore.
Yeah, right. So in your example, it's maybe indeterminism is limited to these two quark A and quark B, but I mean, obviously in real life, I think it's broader than just this quark A, quark B example. But within your example, yeah, you limited essentially libertarian freedom to just quark A versus quark B. But it's still important that it's free will, libertarian free will, and not determined.
So what's the so there's there's so many branches that start springing off of these, but I'm trying to prune away as many of them as possible to kind of limit the how much tangents we go off on. But in this case, so we have a totally depraved person, not yet received prevenient grace. They are not being, are they being held responsible at the, I'll say for the, I'm still trying to pick a good word, but I'm going to say a comparative level. So there's, if you could, I don't know, rob a bank or rob a junkie, and you choose to rob a bank, then you're held responsible for robbing a bank. But maybe on this theory, if there's if the amount of responsibility is based on a comparison of your freedom, so you're unfree as to whether or not you rob, but you are free as to whether or not you rob a bank.
Right. Okay, I'm with you.
So in that case, if that's at some point along that spectrum, obviously, as you said, in the real world, it's not your position and it's no one's position that people only have a freedom down to that one subatomic particle level. That's where their freedom ends. Everything else was outside their ultimate control. But there is some kind of limit, unless you're going to say that a person can be sinless. There's some kind of limit to that, so that at least at the level of generality of doing good, pure absolute good, versus doing evil, anything that is not pure absolute good, at that level of generality, they don't have the power of alternative possibility as to that level. They have it at some lower level, but not at that high level.
Without prevenient grace.
Prior to prevenient grace.
Right. Yes. Yeah, I accept that.
And I think that's what bothers Luther.
As a result, of when Adam previously did have that ability and sinned and fell. Now, I think that last caveat is important in defending the justice of God's commands. Why is it just for God to command perfection? In part because when he gave, basically Adam was able to achieve perfection and fell. God wasn't commanding the impossible in that, because Adam could achieve it. Now we can't, not without grace, but Adam could.
All right. Well, we have. I think we've come to the point of the Luther Erasmus divide on this particular slide. So, and I assume you have more slides. I saw the number 15 popped up when you were showing the last slide. So we've made very little progress so far in the hour that we've gone. Maybe we should start the next slide, or what do you think?
Sure. You want to go through some comments?
Oh yeah, there's at least 20 comments since last time I looked.
Yeah. Let's start going through some. Okay, so Jason, hey Jason, most Christians say that we can do nothing to merit salvation. I agree, but spend a whole lot of breath claiming we must do something. Our words do not align with our words. I'm not sure if you're coming from a free grace standpoint or something like that. Okay, so it is true we should obey God's commands, and that's just because A, it's what God commands, and B, God will reward people in this life and the next for obeying his commands. So I'm not sure if I'm getting at your core concern. But if it's from a free grace standpoint, I will say that we've had debates on those points. We've had many episodes on those, and I'll just refer you to them. And we have our upcoming debate with Charles and Eli, which I'm looking forward to, end of May. I'll leave it at that. I don't know if you want to say something more to Jason here,
or. I mean, it's an important distinction between the fact that we can't merit salvation and we need to do things, but as long as we maintain that distinction, I think it's possible to say both, and it's not a contradiction or it shouldn't be considered a misalignment, I hope.
Right. Okay. Hey, Red Bear, how you been? Okay, so makes no sense. John is being judged for not believing, even though he can't believe. Yeah, so he is. Now, I don't think that God leaves it there. I do think that God does provide prevenient grace to enable John to believe, but even if he isn't at every single point. So, okay, let's talk about that. So on the one hand, I think there's a question of, well, is this before John has heard the gospel, or while John is hearing the gospel, or after John has heard the gospel? I think usually when somebody's hearing the gospel, the Holy Spirit is also convicting that person in their heart, and God is drawing that person to salvation and those sorts of things. So normally, when the gospel is being presented, John is able to believe, but before he's heard the gospel, maybe he doesn't have that specific prevenient grace, and I have to bite the bullet that there is a sense in which I don't think that universal prevenient grace is the case. Now, other Arminians do, and that's fine. But I don't think prevenient grace is the case, and God still holds people accountable. But the justice of God's commands and holding somebody accountable, again, is traced back to Adam, where Adam could perfectly obey God's commands. And so I just basically the way I say it is, the fact that Adam fell didn't force God to retract all his commands and pull them back. No. Those commands are based on God's nature and his standards, and they're perfect and eternal, and they just, he doesn't have to So I mean, I think I just have to bite the bullet on some of that, but I also thank God for His grace that He didn't leave it there. He does provide His grace and enables us to believe. I don't know if you want to comment on RBW.
I mean, I think he's coming from the same point as I am, and I think the only thing I would add or comment, and it's less on adding on what Red Bear Warrior said, it's just responding to something that you raised now and you previously raised as well, that as you go back and you track it back to Adam, I think it's fair to say that that shows that God is not being unjust or something like that, that total depravity is merited by Adam's sin. But I think that it would be hard to suggest that John, not Adam, has any personal control over Adam and Adam's sin. So his ability or his inability to believe before any grace by God, that inability is not a result of something wrong he personally did. It was not an exercise of his free will. Maybe you're going to say it's the result of Adam's free will, but not of John's free will. And John's the one who's being held morally accountable for this. Adam also is, but John is for his unbelief.
So I think that's how do you solve that other than our identity in Adam? Basically, we would have done the same thing Adam would have done. He represented us. How do you get around that without essentially what you believe? Federal headship.
Well, I reject that you need to have this principle of alternative possibilities. That's the way to cut that Gordian knot. And if you reject that, then you're free from having to resolve that particular aspect.
I don't think so. Even if the pap is pap even if it's a conditional pap, I think the same holds good. In other words, the essence of your argument is, well, John himself wasn't in the garden. So why is it fair for God to create John totally depraved and unable to obey? Why is it fair for God to punish John for what Adam did?
Well, why is it fair for God to punish John for what Adam did is one thing to ask. And another thing to ask is whether the man's moral responsibilities are linked to his ability to do otherwise. Those are two different questions. But yeah, I mean, I do have to answer the question of whether it's right for God to visit the sins of the fathers upon the children, the third and fourth generation, etc.
But if that's fair, then there's the answer. I don't think that question suspends on Pap. I think that question suspends on essentially corporate guilt or federal headship, so to speak.
Undoubtedly, there's other things besides the question of John's personal responsibility that need to be addressed. But I was talking about John's personal responsibility. So mentioning the fact that he's put in the state of total depravity through what, in some sense, is not any fault of his own, in some sense, that doesn't mean that that doesn't introduce free will into the equation again.
In other words, I mean, what I'm hearing kind of consistently from you, Turin fan, is you want me to be more Pelagian than I actually am. like I don't know why, but you keep not accepting me as an Arminian, and you just, well, why aren't you more Pelagian, Dan? And that's all I'm hearing. I mean, that's not all I'm hearing, but I honestly, that's what I'm hearing.
No, I would like you to be Calvinist, of course, but the issue that I have is I'm saying that mentioning Adam's the fact that that this total depravity is justly brought on John because of Adam's sin, I think is fine to say that, and I don't have any problem with you saying it. My problem is saying that John is still operating under his own free will as to that issue, because that clearly Adam's free will and John's free will are two different free wills. That's my point.
Okay, so the way I would articulate this is there's a okay, again, previously we made a distinction between pap as the ability to do otherwise and pap as the ability to do good or evil. And now we're making a distinction between pap as the ability to do between good and evil individually for each individual in the human race, or collectively under the federal headship of Adam. And I'm affirming pap as the ability to do between good and evil collectively under the federal headship of Adam, and pap has the ability to do between good and evil for the regenerate believer, and pap has the ability to do between good and evil for those under prevenient grace. But I reject pap as the ability to do good and evil individually for those who are fallen in Adam. Now, maybe the best we can do is articulate the difference and move on, but it seems that you want to apply pap as the ability to do between good and evil for fallen humans, and I'm resisting it because I'm not a Pelagian.
Well, I certainly have no interest or desire in you being a Pelagian. I think your enunciation there was very clear and succinct, and draws out the point. I really don't have anything to add to what you just said, except, of course, that it comes back to the nub of whether or not good and evil at that level of generality is necessary is kind of necessarily implied in pap itself.
Okay, so yeah, there might be a simplicity to Pelagianism. There might be a simplicity to open theism. The problem is that while it might make the explanation of moral responsibility simpler, it makes other things ridiculously complex, and in fact contradicts Scripture. And so I am willing to be very nuanced and kind of eclectic. Take the good parts of Calvinism, spit out the bones. Take the good parts of of non-Calvinism, spit out the bones. And unless I hear that there's a contradiction in my system, I'm gonna keep trucking. But I'm not hearing a contradiction. Now, if you want to say, wouldn't your life be so much easier, Dan, if you just stayed, if you were a Pelagian, if you were an open theist, I hear you. Maybe some things will get simpler, but some things will get a lot tougher.
No, I would say, like, setting aside the name Pelagian or anything like that, there's a sense in which your position might be simpler if you were taking the approach of the provisionists, the Leighton Flower types of the world. Their position in some ways might be simpler because they don't they seemingly don't really have this category of prevenient grace that they have to explain or deal with and so forth. But so what? If it's simpler, I mean, it's just being simpler for the sake of being simpler isn't an advantage. So I wouldn't suggest that we just need to simplify, or certainly not oversimplify. And I appreciate that you're saying that in your view, people have this alternative possibilities, but not between good and evil, as to the person who's pre-prevenient grace and under the fall. So there's the Adam before the fall, the men after the fall, but before prevenient grace, the people with prevenient grace who are not yet regenerated people, glorified people. And you're not saying that they have the power of alternative possibility as to choosing between good and evil at that level of abstraction. They don't have that, but they do have the power of alternative possibility among evil things. And you're okay with that, and that for you, that's enough. And it doesn't, but the question that's raised by the Luther Erasmus debate is whether you have a way to stop along the tree of papt before you get to good and evil.
Right. And by the way, it's not just me. Like, this is the Arminian. Like, Arminius himself said, basically, we're totally depraved. My only concern here is we don't take away free will between the evil options and don't make God the author of sin. But that, I mean, what I'm articulating is the Arminian view, or at least classical Arminian view. Anyways, next question. Let's Paul. Hey, Paul. If grace interposed, it could only take away free will. Well, that assumes that grace is irresistible, not resistible. I think. You're welcome to comment on that, but we can also move to the next one.
Well, yeah, I concede how it works with an effectual calling, that kind of irresistible grace. But which is a grace that comes before faith. It's prevenient in that sense. But the idea that it can only take away free will, it's certainly, I don't see how it could make free will more free. I guess you're saying that it somehow opens up a wider range of options, or a different range of options, or something like that. So I'll leave that. I leave your explanation of your position on that point without. I mean, I don't think it directly affects the slide we're on. So
okay, fair enough. Paul, okay. Theoretically, if free will has equal power to choose all options, then what is needed? What is the need for grace anyways? Okay, so there's a lot going on in there. So I don't think of free will as like this 50-50 type of balance. So our inclination might be 90-10 one direction, or 80-20, or whatever. Like, as long as it's not 1 or 0, right, then I think the will is free. It could be very difficult to make the right choice or the wrong choice, so to speak, because our desires might be so strong. Now, the way I see this is desire is necessary to make a choice. So, okay, so let's take the classic example. The lion eats meat and doesn't eat salad, and the sheep eats grass and doesn't eat meat, or whatever the case might be. Okay, so the reason why is because the lion has no desire to eat the lettuce, and the sheep has no desire to eat the meat. In the same way, we have, without prevenient grace, have no desire to follow Christ. We're at enmity with Christ. But with prevenient grace, we start to desire to follow Christ, but we still have the desire to live for self. And so both options become open, they become possible. But that desire, which is put there by God's grace, is necessary to be able to make that choice. It does not necessitate that we make that decision, but it is necessary to be able to make that decision. Hopefully that at least clarifies my position, Paul. I suspect it's not going to satisfy you, but there it is.
I don't have anything to add on that one.
Okay.
I mean, I guess I should add on that one. There's certainly some other episodes we should do on that subject, but this episode already has so many branching trails and so forth. Anyway, I'll just
sure.
back. Oh, and by the way, I did think of the word I was trying to use, and it was commensurate, or commensurate is the word I was trying to use before. That the freedom is commensurate with the responsibility. In other words, at the same level as the responsibility. So that was my that was the word I was looking for earlier. So my apologies, I couldn't think of it at the time.
So the idea is, the more free we are, the more we're able to do, or vice versa. Is that right?
or the more free we are, the more responsible we are, was the idea there. So, the if you're only free between robbing the bank on Monday versus robbing the bank on Tuesday, then you could be only responsible for when you robbed it, but you can't be responsible for that you robbed it. That idea.
Yeah. Okay. I think I understand the point. And the question there would be, even in that limited sense, is the fact that you held up for one day better than doing it soon? Yeah. So, right. So there's still some level of responsibility even within that commensurate sense, but, yeah. Now, the fact that you are robbing the bank, you're still held responsible for. And again, I would trace that back to Adam, but I understand that we have some differences there. So, anyways, go on to Paul's next question or next comment. If prevenient grace is sufficient for some, okay, and not for others, it is still boils down to the individual's spiritual powers as to who gets saved and not. No. Okay. I think God's grace is sufficient for everyone. Everyone is going to, at some point in life, get sufficient grace that they're able to believe, or at least be let into a position. God is not. He's either giving prevenient grace to enable faith, or at least ready to give prevenient grace to enable faith for everyone. So now if this hasn't been complicated before, it's going to get complicated now. Okay. Adam was not, before the fall, promised grace in Christ and commanded to believe in Christ. That's the new covenant, not the old covenant. So when I said that to defend the justice of God, God's moral commands in the law were not like he didn't have to retract them once he'd given them. That's one thing. But it's another thing to say that Adam kind of lost his ability to believe in the fall. And I think the issue there is there just was no gospel before the fall. And in fact, it's kind of contradictory because he wasn't a sinner, so he didn't need the gospel before the fall. So that covenant came afterwards. And in some sense, God voluntarily obligated himself to provide the grace to enable people to believe if he was going to hold people accountable for not believing. So what?
How is that consistent with what you just said a minute ago?
What part?
The idea that he needs to do this in order to hold people accountable for not believing.
At some point. Not every single moment in time, but he's going to give. God, in deciding to hold people responsible for believing, also essentially committed himself to at least being willing to give prevenient grace.
But why can't he just hold them responsible for not believing one way versus not believing the other way? If they have that power.
Okay, because of the sequence of events. Right. So before the fall, there is no gospel. Right? Once man is fallen, then comes the gospel. So hopefully we're tracking so far. Before the fall is the law and morality in that sense. So God doesn't have to rescind the law, but there is no gospel that God might be forced to rescind or something like that we go through this type of analysis. So after the fall, God decides, I'm going to provide the gospel and I'm going to hold man accountable for the gospel.
Okay.
Now, as part of that, is he commanding the impossible? Well, that would be unjust. So God, in deciding that he's going to provide the gospel and hold man accountable accountable to the gospel post fall also commits himself to providing sufficient grace to believe the gospel.
Based on the premise that God, it's unfair for God to command the impossible.
Yes.
Okay. So if it's impossible for a person to believe
all the time, his whole life.
No, well, is the person not morally responsible until it becomes possible? Okay,
so now we're down to the question of granularity. In God's providence, he has figured out a way at some point during the person's life, he's going to enable them to believe, or he's at least willing to give them the grace necessary to believe. So I'm saying that it boils down to, at least at one point in life, if you're saying, well, why doesn't it apply to every single moment in life? My answer is because he's providing grace at least at some time.
So, I mean, I'm interested in John in the situation we described before. In the situation we described before, he hasn't yet received prevenient grace. He is born under the effects of total depravity, and at the moment, without grace, because you're not a Pelagian, without grace, it is impossible for him to believe.
Yes.
And you said he still is, in that moment, morally responsible to believe.
In that moment, yes.
So how is it?
In part, because God is going to enable him later to believe.
So
that's why I at the time I started talking about, well, has John heard the gospel? Because normally when God tells people the gospel, he's also providing prevenient grace. That's why I made that point at the time.
I can't see how that isn't a modification of the principle. It's a person is when it says is morally responsible, I usually think about that in terms of we're talking about them right at this moment, not them at the end of their life or them before they were born. But the person is morally responsible for what the person has done, meaning the stuff that's just been committed, the past few moments, not the future moments, but just the past few moments, only if the person could have done otherwise.
So, okay. So let's make a distinction. So we've already made this distinction between good and evil, and then between the ability to do otherwise. So I think we should make a distinction between pap and defending the justice of God's commands. Now, what I'm saying is that to defend the justice of God's commands, at least at some point, they can't be impossible. Because if God is commanding something that is altogether entirely impossible, I don't know how to defend the justice of God's commands.
Okay, so let me see if I'm understanding the position you're expressing. Sure. The position you're expressing seems to be saying, even as to John and his moral responsibilities, he is morally responsible to believe, and as to his abilities, at the present time, he is unable to believe. He has a moral responsibility, and currently he's not fulfilling it, and therefore he is in sin. However, it is not fair for God to command the impossible, but that the proposed modification of the system that you're proposing is it's unfair if God makes it or if it's impossible for the person ever to do it, but it could be impossible at nearly every place. As long as there's at least one place where it is possible, then it's okay for him to require it. But he can require it everywhere, even in the places where it's impossible. Is that correct?
Yeah. So right. So okay. So to put it a different way. Let's say that God doesn't have this whole covenant of grace, but rather only extends salvation to John in that one moment when it's impossible for him to obey. Yeah, I would have a very tough time defending the justice of God in that case. I don't know why God could blame John for not believing in that case, because it does seem like you'd just be um, commanding bricks without straw.
But you do think it's okay for him to blame John for not believing right now before he gets to the prevenient grace.
Yes, because when God extended the covenant of grace, it viewed the whole picture, not just that one moment.
I think I understand what your position is. I don't see how it's consistent, but I don't think I can any better explain why I don't think that. So I'm ready to move along unless you have more you wanted to add on that.
No, I hear you. I hear you. So if I try to put a difference on it, so it's not about, for me, it's not about PAP as much here as it is about why is it fair for God to command the impossible. And again, so now we're talking about the new covenant, the one that came after the fall, and God at least sometimes is going to give the grace necessary that we need to be able to obey it, so that he's not commanding the impossible. And it is important that he's not commanding the impossible. Otherwise, it seems like, yeah, people would have an excuse. Okay. Anyways, I think I hear you. Again, would it be simpler if, Dan Chapa, if you said, well, God always enables everyone to always believe the gospel? Yeah, it'd be simpler to answer your question. But the problem with that is the seeds fall on the stony soil. The problem with that is God hardens Pharaoh's heart. The problem with that is God hardened the Jews' hearts. Right? I have to be able to account for those passages where it seems like God is removing his prevenient grace or subtracting it, or basically people can't obey in those cases. So I have to live with that.
I would much rather you go the opposite direction towards people are unable to obey until God gives them grace, and then they do, but not towards the direction you were talking about. But I recognize the difference between your position and the other position. I would prefer you to go in the other direction, not the way. You seem to, like, every time I challenge your point, it seems like you're saying, no, you want me to go farther away from Calvinism. I'm like, no, that's not what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, right. I mean, well, anyways, I don't know. I don't want to misrepresent you, but yeah, that's the way I'm taking it. That you're trying to, but I suspect what would be helpful for me, and you don't have to do it on the spot, is if you can. It seems like your motivation is you're finding some type of inconsistency, and if you could try to pinpoint it, that would be helpful to me. But I'm not asking you to do it on the spot. I'm not even asking you to do it. It's just if you have the time and inclination to give it some thought and say, here's where I think, if I were to boil it down, you're trying to have your cake and eat it too. That'd be helpful, because if I could find that, I would root it out. I don't think I am being inconsistent, but
I'll give it one more shot, like in 5 minutes or so.
Go ahead.
One more shot. Before, if we were to rewind the tape, so to speak, you would hear I asked you about whether he has a moral obligation to believe, even though, because he doesn't yet have any grace, he can't. And you said yes. And then your explanation at that time was because he can reject the gospel in different ways. He can reject it maybe scornfully, or he can reject the gospel in a patient way. But anyway, he's rejecting the gospel, but he has some power over how he rejects the gospel, and therefore he is responsible for rejecting the gospel, something like that. Now, it seems like when it comes to looking at it from the standpoint of God's justice, it isn't enough that God gives people power over how they reject the gospel. He has to actually go do more than just give them power over how they reject the gospel. He actually needs to give them power over whether to reject the gospel. Now, you say that he needs to do that at some point in their life, but yet he doesn't hold them responsible only at that one point where he gives them that grace. He holds them responsible everywhere. So that's where I see that it seems like there's an inconsistency. Either how you reject the gospel is enough power, which if it is, it is. I don't think that it is, because it's not commensurate with the kind of the power is not commensurate with the responsibility in that case. On the other hand, the principle of alternative possibilities deals with with judging a single moment, the thing that the person did at time t0, and not the power that he will have at some point in the future, or that he had either himself or in a federal head in the past. So that's where it seems like there's some inconsistency. I don't know if that's helpful or unhelpful. Maybe I'm just talking in circles, but
Yeah. So, okay, fair enough. So let me see if I can, okay. That would either push me in the direction of, you got to affirm universal prevenient grace, or back down on the requirement that God can't command the impossible. If it holds good. The question I'd have is, okay, when God forms the covenant of grace and is going to require faith in Christ, and so it's not the extension of grace that's the core. It's the holding a person accountable for rejection, for unbelief. At the judgment throne, everyone that's going to be held responsible for unbelief, at least at one point, was or could have been able to have believed and voluntarily chose not to. So they're going to be accountable in that sense. Now, I think your core concern is, why doesn't that, in principle, apply to every single moment of unbelief? Okay, again, we come back to, I think that normally when God extends the call of the gospel, that he is enabling response. So I think here we're going to have two points. So John, before he's ever heard the gospel, does God hold him accountable for believing a gospel that he's never heard? Yes and no. I don't think, because that goes against the principle of, so minimally, responsibility is significantly diminished in the case of ignorance. And I think we would probably agree on that point. But there still seems to be a sin of ignorance. So is there a sin of ignorance of rejecting the gospel? I don't know. That's a tough question. Now, on the flip side, normally a person has prevenient grace when they have the gospel, except in the cases of hardening, and I can attribute that to tracing, to rejecting it when they did have prevenient grace. So perhaps I could avoid your issue using ignorance on the one side and hardening, or judicial hardening, on the other side, without having to commit myself to universal prevenient grace. I could shield myself from your concern, perhaps. Now, I don't want to do that because I haven't thought it through completely. But would that assuage your concern?
No, my concern is, well, first of all, let's just take the easier of the two, the judicial hardening case. So in the judicial hardening case, the person previously did something bad of his own free will, and now God, as a punishment, God is no longer, has somehow prevented him from ever being able to make this good decision as to such and such a thing. And yet the person is being held morally responsible for it. Under the principle of alternative possibilities, he's only responsible if, I'm sorry, he is morally responsible for what the person has done. So, let's say at time t0 is when he gets judicially hardened, and then later at time 1, he now commits some sin, and he couldn't have done otherwise because he was judicially hardened, yet he's held responsible. That would violate this principle of alternative possibilities, since he could not have done otherwise as to the thing that he's now being held responsible for.
Yeah. So right. I think I have to agree that the path between good and evil can't hold good under hardening, assuming that the hardening removes the ability to do good, which it probably does. So yeah, I think I'd have to agree with you, but their responsibility still would hinge on tracing to the previous condition. When it's like, it's like the choosing to get drunk versus maybe after you're drunk you can't control your driving, but you're responsible for both. So I think their tracing does seem to assuage the concern, at least as far as I can see. But in this example, what that means is John, at least sometime prior, heard the gospel, was enabled by prevenient grace, chose to reject it, and now he may be hardened and can't even receive the gospel, and he's still responsible, at least in part, because he rejected when he could believe it.
So I certainly, I think it's great, and I'm fully on board with you holding people responsible and accountable for the things that they do. And I'm okay, at least in principle, with an aspect of their responsibility somehow being traced back to something earlier they had done, or as you mentioned, if you're voluntarily intoxicated and then you go and do something that you shouldn't have done, whether it's murder or anything else, the fact that you voluntarily intoxicated yourself doesn't destroy your responsibility, in the same way as if you were, if someone put the GHB or whatever it is, the roofies drug, in your drink, and then you do something stupid. Now you're involuntarily intoxicated, and it's a little bit different story, because the intoxication is traced, as you said, traced back to you. So, and the intoxication is as what's producing this ill effect. The challenge I have with that is not with your theory of responsibility as such. My problem is, it seems as though in order to hold the correct view that the person is responsible, which you're 100% right that he is, but in order to do that, you're having to throw out the principle of alternative possibilities. I think it would be better just to say, okay, fine, the principle of alternative possibilities isn't an adequate explanation, or isn't even the right explanation. And then we just don't even have to worry about the rest of this, whether it implies the ability to be sinless. You've solved the problem by just saying that moral responsibility isn't through PAP.
But why isn't PAP essential at that earlier source moment that initiated the tracing to, why isn't it relevant that he had PAP, to get drunk or not?
Whether he had a power on a previous occasion is because you're not holding him guilty for the previous occasion. You're holding him guilty for some other thing, not for the thing that he had, where he had the power. You're holding him.
I think I disagree that it's not fundamentally important. Like he really, just from my intuition, people that get drunk are responsible if they kill people when they get behind the wheel or whatever.
Agreed.
Because they get drunk. Yeah. So
right. I totally agree with that. I'm just throwing out the principle of alternative possibility, not responsibility.
But it seems like they could get drunk or not, and They chose to get drunk, and therefore they're responsible for all the downstream consequences of what they do when they're drunk. So PAP is still important. It's just not universal.
Right. But that's where it breaks, because it says only if.
Okay. I mean, but they could have done otherwise. If they didn't get drunk, then they would not have drunk driven and killed somebody while driving drunk. So they could have avoided it.
Well, maybe they could have avoided it. Maybe they couldn't have avoided it. But your punishment. There might be like a punishment for, let's say, public intoxication, getting drunk in public, and that they voluntarily did. They could have done otherwise. But in terms of all the, if what you're saying is, once you consider all the causal factors, the preceding causal factors, to something that happens an hour later.
I think I get what you're saying. So, but it's kind of true. Like if you look at the collision through a soda straw, right? And like say, forget what came before. Yeah. I think then you got a counterexample to PAP within the scope of the soda straw. But once you open up the aperture and say, okay, well, it was a result of something that they could have avoided. In the broader view, they could have avoided running that person over because they could have avoided driving drunk. So, yeah, I don't know why I have to limit myself to the soda straw to validate PAP, and a PAP between good and evil, by the way. But I don't know why I have to limit myself. So again, okay, but maybe this is a fundamental disagreement we have as to, can PAP be used that broader view, or is it forced to look at each incident in isolation of whether that incident could have been avoided? And I mean, the same goes for the fall of Adam. We had this exact same issue with the fall of Adam before. Like, do I have to bracket out the fall of Adam and isolate PAP and PAP between good and evil without considering the impact of the fall of Adam? It seems like in both of them, you're saying, Dan, here's your soda straw. Make sure you use this.
Well, I'm saying that if you're talking about something that a person does, in the case of killing a person, then you're looking at the preceding causal states to that, and you're saying, in this case, if you say, well, in this case, if you look at all the preceding causal states, those fully account for my decision. Therefore, it's not libertarian free will. Therefore, following this principle that of moral responsibility only if I have had the power to have done otherwise, then you would exculpate. You would justify the person. You'd say, no, they was not their free will that they did that. Then you say, well, okay, but that causal state that they were in is the result of something previously that they had done. And so it's okay to hold them responsible, even though the principle of alternative possibilities as to this thing they're doing is, even though it would violate the principle as to this one thing, but because those preceding causal states are themselves the result of something previous, we're going to go back and look at that previous thing, and we're going to say that the person is morally responsible for what the person has done only if the person could have done otherwise at any point in time prior in such a way that it would have changed this result. Now, maybe that's a fair correction to that statement, like a more nuancing of it and so forth. But if you do that, now we're back to John, as you said, and you kind of headed in this direction. We're back to that state about John before, when he's suffering from the effects of Adam's sin.
Well, yeah, real quick. I thought you agreed with that point when you talked about It matters whether he voluntarily got drunk or got roofied.
I agree that it matters for responsibility. I just don't think PAP is the answer.
Okay, but in the soda straw, whether John was roofied and he's roofied behind the wheel, or he's drunk because he chose to get drunk behind the wheel,
Yeah.
if you look in the soda straw, you exclude the roofying and the getting drunk.
Yes, that's true. That is, and that's a valid point to raise. But it's the resolution is a bit different because I'm not relying on PAP in the first place.
Okay.
But anyway, the coming back to John now, John, he doesn't have any ability to have done otherwise than Adam sinning. He does. John doesn't. The human race might, if you consider the human race as a collective, but John, as an individual person, it does not have the ability to have not fallen in Adam.
Agreed.
So if that's the roofie that's affecting his preventing him from believing through total depravity, then it seems.
So okay, that gets down to whether there is such a thing as collective guilt, yeah, right. Because is it a roofie or is it getting drunk? The human race got drunk. The human race didn't get roofied. That's the way I would respond to you. Now, okay. So let's say that the whole human race got roofied. Yeah, then in that case, no, they wouldn't be. I don't think it would be right to hold them responsible.
Interesting. So your way of solving that particular problem is to say that in some sense, John does have free will in the fall.
It's either 100% collective responsibility all the way down, or it could be something like John would have fallen if he was in the same shoes Adam was. I don't know. That's an impossible question for me to answer, I think.
But when you say collective responsibility all the way down, I mean, when it comes to believing or not believing, isn't that an individual responsibility?
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's okay. Yes, that's an individual responsibility. When I say collective, fair enough. So babies are innocent, and babies are condemned. Both are true, right?
Okay.
I mean, Corinthians 11 does say, "Be as innocent as babes, as infants," right? In respect to individual sins, individual responsibility is individual. In that sense, infants are innocent because they do not individually have malice. Maybe they have the seeds that are going to grow into malice, but they don't have malice. And in that sense, you and I should strive to be like babies.
And
okay,
where are you going with this?
Collectively, that same innocent baby is condemned in Adam, not because it individually sinned, but because it's part of the human race.
Okay, so setting aside the question of whether babies have individual sins, which is neither here nor there from my standpoint, I agree with that point that they have responsibility for Adam's sin. Under federal headship principle, they have responsibility for that. However, how does that relate back to this? Does this say, okay, fine, we found another way to get around PAP? Or
yeah, so what I'm saying is, I think you're the one that's being inconsistent by both advancing the argument to hyper-focus on individualism and hold the federal headship at the same time. I don't know how you can have both.
How you can have?
I think your principle of accepting federal headship and your demand that I think you're telling me, Dan, I want you to both accept and reject federal headship.
No, that's not what I'm saying. So what I'm saying is that the principle of alternative possibilities it doesn't work for judicially hardened people, because you have to refer to something else that they did another time rather than the thing they're actually doing.
Okay.
And intuitively, that's not, there's some really strong intuitive arguments against that as well. But that part I have to bracket, because I do agree that there is a free choice that precedes that judicial hardening. And so I kind of have to set it aside based on the fact that there is this, it's a more complicated issue because of that. However, in the pre-regenerate state, before effectual calling, before prevenient grace, after the age of accountability, assuming that there is this group of people who are individually committing sins and yet don't have prevenient grace yet, and yet are morally responsible, despite the fact that they couldn't have done otherwise, at least as to believing the gospel, and yet they're morally responsible for that. To me, that has to say that PAP must not be true of those people. But then to say, well, but they sinned previously in Adam, to which I answer, I agree that they did, but not through their own volition. That the idea of federal headship is not that our volition extends temporally back to Adam, but that we are responsible because he's our federal head for the things he did. So we are already born with a burden on our shoulders that we ourselves didn't create. Adam created. We created it for ourselves in Adam. But as far as our personal responsibility goes, we are not only responsible for Adam's sin, but we're also responsible for our individual sins. And those, up to that point, before this prevenient grace kicks in, there is an inability to do otherwise, and yet there's moral responsibility. Ergo,
otherwise, the inability,
it kicks out.
I think you meant the inability to be perfect, rather than the ability to do otherwise.
There's a command to be perfect.
Yeah, right.
And we're unable to do that. So that's one of the many commands we can't obey. Right. Without prevenient grace, at least.
Agreed. Yeah, I agree.
So, which means we don't have the ability to do otherwise than to violate that law.
We don't have the ability to be perfect. You keep thinking that the only otherwise that exists is perfection.
That is when you're talking about the command to be perfect.
No, it's not. It just isn't. So again, there's many different flavors of imperfection.
Yes, but both of those are not perfection.
Yes, that's true. But there's many different types of imperfection. That's why I keep, well, I don't know. I haven't been able to get that point across to you, but I don't know that I have a different way to explain it. So there's lots of comments that have come in that I need to take a minute and go through. Let's see, yeah, where are we at? Okay, what is this? Red wine. Hey, red wine. Man in a state of innocency had freedom and power of will, and to do that which is good and well pleasing to God, but yet mutably, so I think that's a quotation from either Westminster or London Baptist Confession. Do you recognize that terminology?
It does sound familiar, and there's that little B, which I think is a footnote to one of the proof texts, and the A as well. Yeah.
Okay, so here we got to the distinctions that we've been making here also apply to this quotation, because I think that this sounds like libertarian free will, but I don't think it is. I think it's compatibilist free will, and it is there's a difference that we've been wrangling around between determinism ruling out libertarian freedom. That's one issue. Does determinism basically rule out free will? And then the second question is free will only the ability to choose between good and evil? Because this is the ability to choose between good and evil before the fall, but I think it's a compatibilist type, because I think even the same confession would say that God ordained that man would fall.
Yes, I'm shocked. I'm shocked when I hear people try to argue that the Westminster Confession was adopting a libertarian view.
Well, I'm not shocked. It sounds like it. The problem is that it sounds like it. The problem is the language of compatibilism sounds libertarian. It has to be scrutinized very, very, very closely to detect how it's not. Okay. Do you believe that man still has the knowledge of good and evil? And what is your interpretation of Romans 2? Yes, man has the knowledge of good and evil. And Romans 2, I take those as regenerate individuals, circumcised in the heart, as the end of Romans chapter 2 does. So I think it's talking about Gentile believers who are enabled by God's Spirit to obey his commands. It could also be interpreted, kind of more hypothetically, like what if, like that, theoretically, if you lived a perfect sinless life, you could reach heaven that way. I don't think that's what Paul's up to, but I'm okay with the folks that argue that that's what it means. But I think what it is talking about is regenerate unbelievers. I'm sorry, regenerate Gentiles. I misspoke.
So let me read the text real quickly. The text says, "For not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. For when the Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law, these having not the law are a law unto themselves, which show the work of the law written in their hearts, that their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another." So oh, I'm sorry, I'm really feeding back a lot. So in terms of that, my own view is that man has a conscience which tells him about the difference between good and evil, and I agree. So I agree with that point, and that's true whether or not the person is regenerated, from my standpoint.
Okay.
I don't know if that is different or the same as what you just said.
So that's the other side, but I'm okay with that. I mean, I'm okay with your view there. It's just I prefer my view, but
okay. So it's different. Okay.
Yeah.
That's I wasn't trying to argue it. I was just making sure I understood. Because you had something at the end where you said you were changing word, and I just want to make sure.
Fair. Okay. Why is it fair to reward us for what Christ did? It's a free gift. Yeah, it's a free gift. So I'm not sure that justice is the right way to analyze it at all. But can God give his grace to whoever he wants to? Yes, he can. And it's not, I don't know what the injustice of giving a gift would be. Like, why would it be unjust to give somebody a gift? Maybe I'm misunderstanding the point, Paul. If I apologize if I'm missing it, but I don't know what the challenge would be to, I don't know what the challenge would be to giving somebody what's the justice concern in giving somebody a gift? I don't know of any laws that are like prevent you from giving gifts. It's not a bribe, so.
I would draw a distinction. So on the one hand, if what Paul is asking is literally what he's asking, it's fair because Jesus is, out of his love, has voluntarily provided that for us, and the Father has agreed to accept it from Jesus. So that there's nothing unfair about someone doing something good for another person, and especially when it doesn't, especially when justice is still served because the punishment of sin is still borne, and so on and so forth. So there's that aspect to it. I wonder if Paul is thinking of kind of a symmetry here, in the sense that if it's unfair to punish people for what Adam did, then it should be unfair to reward people for what Jesus did. But Dan isn't arguing, for whatever it's worth, Dan is not arguing that it's unfair to punish people for what Adam did. I don't think, unless I misheard you.
Right. Okay. So comment from Dan, another Dan. Hey, Dan. Okay. So libertarian free will is not compatible with Scripture. For example, Mark 4:11 through 12. What does Mark 4:11 through 12 say? And Jesus said to them, to you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but to those outside, everything is in parables, so that they may indeed see what has been see but not perceive, and they may indeed hear but not understand, lest they should turn and be forgiven. So that's the famous quotation from Isaiah 6. It's quoted many places in the New Testament. I think this is a case of, well, whether it's a case of judicial hardening or not, let's say for the sake of discussion that it is a hardening, a divine hardening, rather than. So God is withholding the gospel by speaking in parables, and maybe his purpose is that most people look at it as the messianic secret, or like basically to end up with the crucifixion. This is part of God's plan in doing that. So God had good reasons for doing this, for sure, no question about it. But he did. He hid this gospel. Now, perhaps they had heard it earlier and rejected it, and they're being hardened for that reason. I think in these stories, doesn't it say the people's hearts can be stony, and they can have the seed but not get it? He also says, to him that hath, more can be given, and to him that hath not, it'll be taken away that which he hath. I think you get that in the Matthew account of the same thing. So that suggests that perhaps they had prevenient grace. Let's see. Let's look at that. What is that? Matthew 13. Let's see. Okay, so in Matthew 13:10, the disciples came to him and said, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" And he answered, "To you has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For to the one who has, more will be given, but he will have an abundance. But to the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand." So it's this idea of, because they rejected earlier, God takes away what they have. But if they had accepted what they heard, he would give them more. So I think that's the way. So now that goes back to the whole tracing discussion that Turretin, Fan, and I had in terms of hardening, and is it fair to look at that previous state? So I'll refer you also to that, but I don't see this as incompatible with libertarian free will. But anyways, I'll leave it at that. You probably have lots to say on this point, so eager to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Dan. I didn't think I'd hear you. Didn't think you'd hear me say that. No, I do. I mean, I agree with the Dan, which has the banana as a telephone there in his picture. Just that that libertarian free will is not compatible with Scripture. Assuming that's what he means when he says free will, he means libertarian free will. If he just means the ability of us to make decisions, then that Scripture clearly teaches. But Dan and I, the Dan of Conversations in Calvinism, have done at least one debate on that, and lots of episodes. So.
Okay. Man, there's so many comments. I'd love to. There, let's see. So Paul, let me, and I apologize if I'm skipping comments, but okay. So G Atlas sounds like Dan is saying that PAP is an internal prevenient grace, which is Arminian, whereas PAP as a natural ability is Pelagian. Um, with lots of qualifications, I could say yes. PAP as in the ability, not the ability to do otherwise, but the ability to choose between good and evil, the ability to be perfect, yes, is a result in our fallen condition, and in the sense of the ability to be perfect is a result of prevenient grace and not a natural ability. Yes, I agree on that point. Okay. Turton Fan, we would be honored if you joined us, Provisionist. Come to, okay. We will see. You'll I'm thank you, GMW. I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate a lot about provisionism, but I am solidly in the total depravity camp. I could make my life simpler and remain in the Arminian camp by affirming some type of universal prevenient grace that would dodge a lot of the criticisms, but I'm not driven by what makes things simple. I want to avoid contradictions in my view, but most importantly, I want to stay faithful to Scripture. And the Bible does talk about hardening. And so I have to live with that, even if I get some complicated questions from Turton Fan on tracing and this and that. I think I have good answers for them. I don't see the contradiction that's supposedly there, but I'm going to stick with Scripture, even if it'd be simpler not to. But I will say this: it makes one thing simpler and makes a mess out of other things.
All right. Well, we have gone for, let's see, over 2 hours. I think this might be a convenient breaking point, unless you have other comments you wanted to address.
No, that'd be good. So we got one slide, one of Dr. Bion's slides. That's the way these things go, as well they should. Okay, I appreciate you. That was a really good conversation. It is cool that, look, there's a lot of things we agree on, and I think it shows up in a lot of episodes, but there are some things that we disagree on. And sometimes we need to surface those and address them, even if we can't resolve them. I think we, have to admit that, there are some differences between us. So I appreciate the iron sharpening. I'm going to go put some bandages on after you beat me up like that, but no, it's all good stuff. So I appreciate it. And I appreciate all the comments. Oh my goodness, so many comments, so many good comments from all these. So GMW, Michelle, Paul, Truth Defenders, G Atlas, Dan, the imposter with the banana telephone. Let's see.
Paul Anchor, Truth Defenders.
Red Wine, Red Bear Warrior, if there's lots of red. There's a Turton Fan in the comment box.
Yahoo as well. I don't know if he has some comments that were a bit off of the main. We didn't really get to them, but they were a little bit off of the topic. One of them was about Nadab and Abihu. Anyway.
Yes, and MK Vine. Okay, cool. Anyways, thank you. It was a great discussion, and God be with you.
And also with you.